Good evening. My name is Jeff Rosenheim. I'm the Joyce Frank Menschel Curator in charge of the Department of Photographs, and it is a pleasure to have you here. It is a Thursday night before the Friday opening of our exhibition, Bernd and Hilla Becher, which is a retrospective of the works of two amazing German artists who came together and made photographs that changed my life. I hope for those of you who have not seen the show, you will come in the next days. Many of you may have seen it. We've been in previews at the Met. And I want to thank the team of people that helped bring this exhibition together, which is Max Becher, who is the son of the artists, and his colleague Chris, and the team in Cologne where the artist archive was placed by the artists. And those of you who know the Met, we have had two artist archives, Walker Evans, complete archive of Walker Evans, the American photographer, and D.N. Arbus, both of which I've shown multiple times here in the museum. And we just acquired the archive and collection of James Van Der Zee, the studio photographer who worked in Harlem from the aughts until 1983 when he passed. Amazing body of work. We're just beginning to catalog it. But tonight, we are here to celebrate the Becher exhibition in advance of it in a special program called MetSpeaks. And the title of this presentation is Bernd and Hilla Becher and the Photographic Afterlife of Heavy Industry. The program is part of this special MetSpeaks program, which brings together some of the most erudite, respected, and compelling thinkers on any given subject or a variety of subjects. And we're thrilled to have Lucy Sante and Owen Hatherley here with us. One of them, Owen, came from very far away, and we thank you from flying over the Atlantic to join us. Lucy came from upstate New York. And Lucy, thank you for joining us. Lucy's been one of my thought partners for many exhibitions. We share a love of the work of Walker Evans in vernacular photography, and particularly the sort of aspects of the photographic medium that others haven't paid too much attention to. I'm going to offer a preview before I give the floor to our speakers. I'm kind of going to moderate it, but since the exhibition isn't open, I thought I would both introduce the speakers just a bit and then do a quick run through to get our feet wet, if you will, before the discussion. We are grateful to all of the donors and friends group members of the Alfred Stieglitz Society and other friends groups here at the Met. We rely on your support. And for this one, I want to thank Joyce Frank Menschel, our great patron and trustee, Barrie and Deedee Wigmore's Foundation, Edward John and Patricia Rosenwald Foundation, and our great collector friend Linda Macklowe for supporting the exhibition, and to Mary C. and James Fosberg Publications Fund and the Mellon Foundation, who helped bring the exhibition catalog to life. So that's the sort of background. Now let me introduce our speakers just briefly. They're in the front row. You'll see them a little bit better in a moment. Lucy Sante is a friend and the author, a friend of mine and my wife's for a long time. He's the author of Low Life, Evidence, The Factory of Facts, many books. Kill Your Darlings, Folk Photography, The Other Paris, Maybe the World Would Be the Times, and most recently 19 Reservoirs, which is not out. Coming out in 2 weeks. You've heard it here first. It's about the New York reservoir system. Her awards include a Whiting Writers Award, Kelly, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Grammy for album notes, an Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography, a Guggenheim and Cullman Fellowships. And Lucy teaches writing and the history of photography at Bard, but I think I learned today that that is still going on. Owen Hatherley. Writes on culture and politics for various publications. He's the author of many books, like Lucy, including Militant Modernism, Landscapes of Communism from Penguin, Red Metropolis, and his recent books include a collection of essays, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances, Modern Buildings in Britain, also for Penguin, and Artificial Islands. He's the commissioning editor at Jacobin, the editor of the alternate guide to the London boroughs, and the culture editor of Tribune, and probably many other things we may hear about. Please join me in welcoming then for our conversation, but we're going to delay that welcome until we look at some pictures. Okay, what is the work of Bernd and Hilla Becher? First of all, the show opens tomorrow and is up until November. Tell everybody, please come. We need to have you see these pictures and to tell others about them. We're self-promoting here tonight. I'm very pleased to say that our wonderful team in Photo Studio made some very early and provisional and wonderful pictures of the installation. So when you get upstairs, you'll see on a pedestal, free-floating, this fabulous photograph of a Belgian water tower. And maybe Lucy will tell us a little bit more about its resonance for him. The water tower is a typical example of industrial architecture, generally neglected, that's part of the physical environment, but not accorded its status. And one of the things that the Bechers did was to photograph things that they thought had great sculptural value, but were not part of the sort of high cultural appreciation, architecture perhaps without architects. These are workers' houses in the Siegen district, where Bernd Becher grew up. He grew up in Siegen, and she grew up in Potsdam in East Germany. The second gallery really looks at the archival material that helps us tell the story of how the Bechers achieved what they did, a strong interest that you will see in both the photographic aspect and drawing and painting by Bernd. He was interested in that built environment as it was declining, as the industry was changing and those mines and factories were were being closed. When you turn the corner in that gallery, you see a video that was made by Max Becher, who is actually with us here tonight. This is the ubiquitous orange VW van that they traveled around Germany and basically Western Europe. They had a separate van, this one, in the US that they had at their disposal. You can see some posters and some works in cases. In the third gallery, or one of the other galleries, we show the architecture, we show the art of their peers, Carl Andre and Saul LeWitt, who were their friends. When the Bechers emerged in the 60s and early 70s, they showed at the Conrad Fisher Gallery, which also represented these American minimalist sculptures. So it's an effort by us to put those works into context, for us to understand where they found the sculptural form in their work and how they did so. The last and big gallery of the exhibition is a big hall that shows these large typologies, which I'm going to show in detail. And also you can see in the foreground several of the books. The Bechers realized that they could communicate their ideas about the art that they were making through the book form much easier than they could in getting exhibitions. Although early in this, even in the late 60s and 70s, they were able to find museums and galleries to represent them. But these books are their own archive of images that we'll talk about probably. The first book they did was this 1970 book. This is the English version, even though it has a German title, Anonyme Skulpturen, or Anonymous Sculpture. And it is a study, in this case, of lime kilns. But the book really was their calling card, and it established their interest in these industrial forms that were very much a part of the lives of industry around the world. And they photographed them with a certain style and a certain technique, very carefully, generally with overcast skies, to show the silhouette of the forms and allowed a kind of comparative study like you see here. This is a picture of gravel plants. It's the signature image. Did anyone see the poster, the banner on the front of the museum? No. No one saw the banner on the front of the museum. I highly recommend you look at the front of the museum. We have this picture blown up really large. These are gravel plants primarily in Germany, and these are just crazy forms. You know, gravel is mined. It's an industrial material. It's used for all sorts of buildings purposes, including roads. It's a valuable industrial material, and the buildings that are part of the creation of gravel and the marketing and distribution of gravel have this wonderful dynamic. The Bechers put pictures together in a very specific way, and they allowed us to compare and contrast. They were curators of their own archive. They made these pictures over decades, and then they created this, if you will, three-dimensional, sculptural, even though it's flat, sculptural form that allows us to see that their archive was an active one that was built over time. I think you can see that the date of this work is 1965 to 1992, 65, 75, 85, that's 37 years it took them to create this collection or grid of pictures. I think you, when you see the exhibition, you'll see what the effect is. They wrap around you. This is like 8 feet wide. There's one that's 30 pictures wide. That's 20-something feet long. They were in their work. They were working in a documentary vein against the standard and most prolific art photography genre, which was the handheld 35 millimeter off-kilter style of Cartier-Bresson, Robert Frank, Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander. And they were interested in a very different use of photography, and that's what we're featuring. When they started teaching at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf, their students became the most famous photographers today. Thomas Struth, Andreas Gursky, Thomas Roof, Candida Hoffer, among others. We are practically introducing the parents of those star photographers in this exhibition. Here's another example of a single plant with all the different kind of forms you might see in that plant. This is a beautiful, beautiful grid of pictures. Simple facades of industrial buildings that are not neglected in the sense that they're falling apart, although some were, but they're neglected as examples of the architectural patrimony. Here's winding towers in primarily France and Belgium. And here's really the biggest typology they made. These are blast furnaces. Again, I see that there's a typo in my label. It's not 1960 to 1993. I'm very sorry. Take that back. But we're talking about more than 30 years of putting together a typology this size. They couldn't do that at the beginning because they didn't have the examples. All right, singleton pictures. They also made large-scale single pictures like the water tower or this blast furnace or this wonderful gas tank that looks like a summer melon to me. Or in Wales, this terrific picture of the steel form of a winding tower, or one of my favorites, this sort of giant's wooden hat that is actually a cooling tower in the Ruhr, or one of my other favorites, this coal bunker with a quenching tower next to it. These are terms I had to learn. We had to learn. They also turned the camera the other way and made landscapes, and they made terrific pictures that they didn't release until the end of their pretty much the end of their career, which are much more narrative, much more looking at the landscape like a 19th century photographer, which they adored, that style. Here we are in Sauerland in Germany, in Passau, along in the Ruhr again. And lastly, I'm just closing with a few of the archival materials. The methods they used are fascinating. This did not come easy. They worked very hard to get access to these places, and then they kept on keeping notes. So whenever they could, when the weather was right and the opportunity was provided, they could go back and make additions to their archive and collection. Bernd was a particularly good draftsman, in my opinion, and his ability to synthesize and to express what he was trying to do, they were trying to do. They worked collaboratively. Here's a picture of Hilla with her hard hat in the US, in Youngstown, with the camera. You can see the size. It's like a 5x7-inch camera and that ubiquitous van. Here they are in France with a different van. Do you see where the camera is? Don't miss that. Would you go up there? Okay, it's windy up there. It's dangerous up there. And yet, it was important that they photograph each building appropriately. And I close with this lovely picture of the artists. All right, that's the setup. And I thank you very much. And now, please welcome Lucy, Sante, and Owen Hatherley. Thank you. I was going to initiate discussion by saying, when did you first see the works of the Bechers, and maybe share your particular experience with just one picture?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the 1970s, as an avid reader of art forum, when I took it out of the college library, or couldn't afford one in those days, I had mixed feelings about the minimalist work of that time. And then I saw the Becher's work, and seeing it in that context, I understood a whole lot about the sculpture of that period suddenly, by through its metaphorical function, its rhyming, its exemplary illumination of certain characteristics of 70s minimalist sculpture that was reusing industrial materials. And industrial materials were something I knew all about because I came from a working class background. My father worked in factories. And seeing their pictures, I understood both how minimalist sculpture was related to this, and also how the things that the Bechers photographed, which were industrial plants or parts thereof, were in themselves sculptures. And I did remember that term, anonymous sculpture. So that was a moment of illumination, and I remain fascinated by their work, much more than by the associated sculpture, by the way, because I was becoming interested in photography, and the just the law of their work, the graphic qualities, but also the incidental qualities and where these were located and so on. Jeff very kindly put the water tower in my hometown on the cover, and it's the first image you see in the beginning of the show, Verviers, Belgium. I'm not certain I've ever seen it in life, because it's not like, in a Belgian city, it's not like it's going to hover over the high school football field the way it does in an American town. It's probably somewhere in the outskirts, but I love it. It's very Jules Verne to me, with that sphere and that the lighthouse on the bottom. It's very Captain Nemo, I mean, I'm picking that one out because, of course, when facing an audience, my mind goes blank. But there are many more of their works that I've particularly related to.
So I think I came to it via one kind of pop cultural source and one sort of more avant-garde source, which I think makes a degree of sense. The pop cultural source is really, really obvious, for which I apologize, which is Kraftwerk. And there's such an obvious kind of connection between their kind of sort of deadpan, but also quite sort of ingenuous and sincere kind of love for the West German industrial landscape and the West German urban landscape and what the Bechers are doing. And I think that was one of the places of sort of trying to kind of trace things that they were obviously into, finding that and being like, well, this is another thing that's happening in Dusseldorf in the 1970s, and the links are very, very, very clear. And particularly that kind of combination, that's ambiguity that's not cynical. Like, it's not sort of obviously celebratory, but it would be a mistake to see it as something sort of dystopian or bleak as well. It's kind of, there's a sort of great deal of enthusiasm along with a kind of very, very dry wit, which I think is going on there. The other one is the English filmmaker who I can't imagine is particularly big in the US because his concerns are local and to do with the peculiar histories of British capitalism, which is a filmmaker called Patrick Keeler, who's best known for 3 films, 2 made in the 90s and 1 made about 10 years ago, which follow a kind of invisible character called Robinson who explores the English, specifically English built environment. In order, basically, there's a sort of element of them of trying to kind of find out a crime, who kind of committed the crime in a murder mystery. And that particular crime is the destruction of the visible industrial landscape. And that point of it being visible. So one of the things that becomes clear in his films as they go along is that there is still an industrial landscape, but you can't see it, or at least it's very, very difficult to get to the point where you see it. Whereas the Becher's work is so much about sort of celebrating this sort of visible landscape. And so I guess those are the 2 points where it came in. In terms of favorite photo, I don't have a specific favorite photo, but I have a specific favorite typology, which is the gasometers, which is, again, is partly for sentimental reasons. Like Lucy,
gasometers are the containers, the containers
sort of,
that are generally spherical that rise and fall and contain gas. And as they rise, they have more gas, and as they fall, they have less.
You'll have seen them earlier on, the kind of great cylindrical kind of skeletons. So, like Lucy, I am a hipster from a proletarian background, so I have a certain sort of difficult relationship with this sort of stuff. And I remember a lot of those growing up, and I have a sort of a liking for them as sort of sentimental forms.
You came up with, over a very pleasurable set of discussions, the idea of the photographic afterlife of heavy industry. Do you want to muse on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I'm struck by looking at these, how, it reminds me these pictures remind me so much, excuse me, of the language, the landscape of my youth, and how to people born after 1980, 1990, I don't know, much of this has just vanished. It no longer exists. It happened while my back was turned, sort of. I lived in New York City for 30 years where there were not many industrial structures, and then I immediately moved to the country. So, I'm thinking, like, are those gasometers in Bayonne still there? All the heavy industry of these various New Jersey corridors, not to mention Europe, they're gone. In fact, well, my hometown, Verviers, its dead factories were still there in the late 1990s. Now they are all gone, and it's like the city is a skull with missing teeth. There's and you sort of sense that in certain American cities. You drive into Akron, Ohio, and there are vast absences of anything, and that's where big plants were. And this is true in places except, well, there are places like Detroit where the industry is so large that it cannot be taken down because it's unaffordable to do so. But that's an exception. For the most part, these are monuments to a way of life that ruled the Western world, at least for the better part of 200 years. It has perhaps migrated to some other parts of the world, which I'm not personally familiar with. But in any event, these mark off not only these, well, remarkable works of anonymous sculpture, but also landscapes that dominated the lives of an enormous number of people, dominated their working day, their family life, dominated the clock of their entire lives, and were always present, hovering in the background. Smokestacks in every town, major smokestacks. There's still some here and there, but not like the just intense amount of them that used to rule the world. So I see, beyond the beautiful qualities of the photographs themselves, the selection process and what they're showing, the taxonomy, the typographical initiative there, the very subtle humor that comes in. Besides all these things, they are also a cenotaph collectively to a bygone way of life, about which I feel, bittersweet, as one would.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it sort of goes back to the earlier point about looking for industry in the 1990s and finding that it isn't where you expect it to be. And I suppose, I, as a sort of writer on architecture, which is mostly what I do, I wrote 2 books in the 2010s about British cities, and it involved at certain points trying to find industry, and you could usually find it, and it'll have a skeleton staff, it'll be mostly automated, and it will be in an enormous shed. It will be in an enormous white shed on the freeway, and it will be there. And Germany, is still one of the world's major industrial powers. Like the US, in its way, still is an industrial power. Britain rather less so, because we're a very, very weird country. But nonetheless, somewhere like Sheffield, and they've photographed in and around Sheffield, I believe, in South Yorkshire, it still produces as much steel as it ever did. It just does it with about 10 workers and an enormous black painted shed on the freeway. So that idea of a kind of a kind of landscape that people live in, and B, a landscape that you can see, that's what disappears, I think. And I'd be kind of intrigued as to whether they ever kind of got interested in sheds, because sheds are such a, but by sheds, I suppose I mean it's a sort of, I mean this in its technical sense, if you get me, which is the kind of the sort of stuff that Ford started doing from the late 30s onwards. So if you look at kind of American industrial architecture, and Rainer Banham writes about this very well in his book Concrete Atlantis, it shifts over the course of the 20s and 30s from this kind of very, very kind of Becher's architecture of stuff to look at. Kind of great big kind of like gantries and huge concrete factories and kind of interesting skylines and, sculptural architecture. And then as they start streamlining things in the 30s, a kind of real kind of industrial takeoff of the kind of Fordist economy, and of Ford in particular, is in gigantic concrete and glass sheds, almost impossible to photograph. The wartime economy was very much kind of, through these things. And they become the sort of dominant form of industrial architecture after that. And there's exceptions to that. And one of the big exceptions is oil refineries, which I think are things of astonishing beauty. But them aside, it's the world of sheds.
Yeah, so I don't want to answer. There's some experts in the room that know more than I, actually. We have the artist's son. But I think they did photograph some shed types. I just don't know whether they completed that and we can see it. But Max?
They were, like you said, very hard to photograph.
Yeah.
So I think they did not go very far with that.
Yeah. It's interesting that some of their students, and some students not of the Bechers but influenced by them, did photograph sheds, and especially these sheds that have the logo of the company on them. And I'm blanking on who that. Thank you, Frank Breuer, who may have been a student of the Bechers, but is in their second generation. Thank you, Virginia. Is that Virginia? Yes, thank you, Virginia. Back row, you get credit. Virginia is an author of the catalog, so it's good that she has instant information.
But the other thing with sheds is their total adaptability, which of course is why they're so popular. Like in my hometown, so I grew up in Southampton, which is where the ships used to leave from Lower Manhattan to go to Europe, and obviously since air travel, they do no longer do this. The Queen Mary still does it, I think, but the Queen Mary II, rather. There's a sort of large container port, and a very, very large shed was built just before there was a recession in the early 1990s in the UK. And this huge kind of white shed was built. And then the recession meant that there was much less goods coming in, and they had to work out what to do with this gigantic shed. And they turned it, of course, into a multiplex cinema and nightclub, which was called Leisure World. And so you can stick anything in those things you like, and there's no sense of you will not know what they are from looking at them.
In my catalog essay, I mentioned this extraordinary documentary by Wang Bing called West of the Tracks. Did you ever see it? And it's about the decline of industry in this particular industrial location in China. There are these gigantic, cyclopean factories built, I don't know when, great leap forward, 1950s.
Just to chip in, lots of them were built by the Japanese when they were colonizing it as Manchukuo.
No kidding, I didn't know that, thank you. So Wang Bing leads you into some of these edifices, and you go through and you're walking seemingly, because the 9-hour length indicates there's a lot of stuff in real time, and you're walking seemingly forever through this factory until you finally get to the corner where there are 8 men doing zinc smelting, and the rest of it is empty. It's talk about sheds.
Yeah, so this idea, I think that both of you mentioned about the Bechers needing to have a kind of sculptural form that isn't a box. Mm-hmm. And that those forms, I'm thinking of, Charles Sheeler and crisscross conveyors, all of the River Rouge, all of that dynamic, all those diagonals, all of those crazy tubes and forms. I mean, those of us have ever seen it's not there anymore, the Bethlehem Steel Factory in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Walker Evans photographed it in 1935, the cemetery in the foreground, the workers' houses in the middle ground, and the huge steelworks in the background. The Bechers photographed it as well. It's all gone. All the landscape is there, but the industrial scape is gone. So in terms of afterlife, there's also this afterlife of photography. Like these buildings called for the camera, called for an artist, who were drawn to these forms for various reasons. What artists find inspiration in all different ways. Some people, it's their garden, which they paint. Some people, it's a high mountain pass. For some, it's a beautiful trout stream. For the Bechers, they were legitimately inspired by and fascinated by the visual language of industry, which now is in its photographic afterlife. So how do we read that?
Well, I mean, it feels like industry has become invisible the way money has become invisible. It's everything now is either it's been miniaturized or whatever, but or hidden away far from prying eyes, because this is no longer public information, even if it's absolutely neutral and of no benefit to anyone. It's hidden away. Whereas 19th century industry, which is where many of these things come from, even those that were built in the 20th, they were proud. It was a display. You read about the first big factories of the early 19th century, and they made them look like castles with crenellated walls and turreted corners. That didn't last too long, but there was still the impulse of having the biggest smokestack in town, so to speak. And now it's, you know, don't worry your pretty little head. It's going on in the back. You will see the results in your, you know, in the local newspaper, in your Wi-Fi. Yeah, yeah.
In my hometown, there was an area that was redeveloped in the late 80s and early 90s into what here would be described as condos and another multiplex cinema. And it somehow, so it's on a peninsula, and it somehow is arranged in such a way that you can at no point see the sea. And the reason why it's arranged so that you can't see the sea is that when you see the sea, you can see the container port and the oil refinery. And they had an absolute idea that, like, no one will buy these flats if you can see the container port and the oil refinery. So we're basically blocking the whole of the fucking sea off from these apartments that face the sea, which is extraordinary to me. But I mean, and it's a thing in a lot of those sorts of places. The only place where I've seen where the apartments seem to face the container port is Hamburg, which I think says a lot about Germany in general. I think their kind of attitude to that afterlife is slightly different to a lot of others. But the
I think
go
on. I'm from Missouri, so I the ocean and the edge is a totally different thing for me. But I love that route from the Newark airport into the city, and you pass by this port with those stacked containers, and it makes me feel like I'm a little kid again with Legos. And I'm sorry, I think that is beautiful. That is my definition of some weird dystopian beauty. And I like seeing it. I would hate it if they put the barricade like they do to stop the highway noise in Greenwich, Connecticut. I love seeing that, and I have the pleasure of not having to live right there. I'll admit that, but visually, I'm interested in that, and I think container shipping is fascinating.
And which makes me think, by the way, because of the location of the Elizabeth and the Newark Airport and the Elizabeth Port, that in fact, what you see in place of the factory districts of most cities in the West is the IKEA.
That's where it is.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how you can see that's the scene of the crime. Yeah. But there's always that question with these things, and I think it's one that I think some Hilla Bechers kind of get away with. Like, I never kind of find it annoying, but that question that, like, Brecht famously kind of like and getting really annoyed at Renger Patch. So Renger Patch, for those that don't know, is a German industrial photographer, did a book called The World is Beautiful of industrial photography in the Weimar era, which wound up a lot of left-wing artists and intellectuals, I think largely because of the fact that, so there's this Brecht quote, which he attributes to someone else, but it's basically him, that, looking at an image of one of these factories tells us absolutely nothing about the social relations within that factory. Yeah. And with a couple of exceptions, which are in the landscape part of the exhibition, it's generally true of the Bechers as well. But it doesn't have that kind of sentimentality is not quite the right word, but Renger Patch is doing something which is very, very close to how those companies would themselves market their products, which the Bechers are obviously not.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There is the Bechers, as I read them, are not proselytizing for labor or for industry. They're somewhat protected by a kind of neutral position. Their historic the precedent, let's say in Renger Patch, seems to have a kind of polemic that is grating, and it's selling something, and I don't see it, I don't feel it, and I look for it in all art, that they're not selling that. They're doing it for a very different reason, and it rings true. It's hard to exactly say what where it changes, there's a visual component to it. And it's not looking up and heroicizing the buildings. It's not looking down on it. But yes, in the landscapes, it gets a little more complicated. But there is a kind of honesty of purpose and a clarity of vision in the Becher's work, which I greatly admire.
But I suppose the thing I suppose I'm getting at is, so I have a very fond memory, and I think he was kind of playing up to me and doing it, of going to Tate Modern. So for the 2 or 3 people here that probably don't know what it is, it's in a former power station in the south bank of the Thames. And I was going there for the first time with my dad in about year 2000, 2001, and him going, "Oh, I've worked in turbine factories like this, in turbine halls like this." And I was like, "Oh, yeah. Because this is a turbine hall of a power station." And he immediately saw it as a turbine hall of a power station. And he loves going there. But I think and he's quite exceptional in that, for one thing, he no longer works in the factory. But I think there is that thing of like, whether you're supposed to look at it or not, and who is looking at it, and whether or not, that you're sort of trying to kind of make people look at a thing they're not normally looking at. But there's a kind of class aspect to that that's kind of tricky. And I think, so for instance, when the kind of South Yorkshire and South Wales landscapes that they photographed, the kind of coal mining landscapes were photographed, there was a real kind of very bittersweet thing about how they were just erased within 10 years. Like 1 or 2 would be left as a museum, and you could go down like the Big Pit in South Wales and, crawl about for a bit and then come back up. But most of them are just these kind of blank green landscapes, sometimes with suburban houses on, mostly not, just like green and nothing. And it's not farmland, and it's just this kind of green nothingness. And I think people had a certain kind of like being glad it's gone, but also being hurt that it was gone, and just that, had these very, very difficult feelings that, I think are sort of orthogonal to this, let's say.
We were talking yesterday about when many of us were gathered in the galleries to talk about these things, about how there's no preservation motive in the Becher's work exactly. But on the other hand, to what extent it was conscious or whatever, they were heralding, they were documenting the end of industry, and they must have been aware of that fact to some degree. And one thing that makes me think of, that Owen reminded me of, is the impossibility of undertaking such a project at any earlier point, because for one thing, there were ideological pressures, and as Jeff said, I mean, if you look up, you're exalting. If you look down, perhaps you're also exalting. But in any event, if this work had been done in the 1930s, it would inevitably have been selling something just by the virtue of its existence. Now, in being done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there somehow it's no longer a fact that if you take a picture, you're advertising Ford or you're advertising, Magnitogorsk. Instead, it's not exactly removed from the experience, but it's removed from that particular debate. And the fact is that, they're not Rengerpatch, because even though it's reducing a form to the single form, and in the case of the water towers, the gasometers, etc., that's all you see. Even so, there are, you cannot keep those creeping other bits from, so you are clearly on planet Earth. But the landscapes are a revelation. I mean, it's Owen who pointed out there's one of them in, I forget where it is now, Luxembourg possibly. There's this giant conveyor that is directly over the workers' housing below. So you see the whole panorama. You see the relation of labor and capital in process right there.
But there is that question about context and decontextualization, and there's one thing that I just love in the film of them going around in the camper van, of of like cutting down a tree and just getting this thing out of the way so that you can have that image. And what that made me think of, and this is because I think far too much about these sorts of things, is a thing that happened when James Athenian Stewart was compiling the antiquities of Athens in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. So he was a sort of Scottish architect and popularizer of the true Grecian architecture, and went off to the Ottoman Empire to document it, and found that someone had his house in the way of, if I remember rightly, the Temple of Olympian Zeus. Anyway, paid the person to demolish his house. I was just like, right, here you go. Here's a load of money. We're going to demolish your house, and then I'm going to sit here and draw your. And of course, a tree is not a house, so it's not. There's not the same level of it being very, very kind of fraught. But there is that thing of just like you need to go through a certain process to find the monument that it is that you want to kind of emphasize. And within that, there's that. I mean, this goes right back to Le Corbusier retouching grain silos in order to make them look more like his own architecture. Which, of course, and one of the great things about the grain silos that you see in those is that they haven't been retouched. So you can see that they've got like quite a lot of strange architectural forms on them that Le Corbusier would be very upset by.
Is it Corbusier was retouching them to make them cleaner?
To make them look like to make them look like the architecture of ancient Egypt, which was his big obsession. That these were, and I should also go, which I think starts with Gropius when Alma Mahler goes off to tour the States with her husband and sends off to her lover Gropius a load of photographs of grain silos, and it's like, look at these, they're amazing. So we owe this all to Alma.
In Buffalo, New York, up the Hudson. You can go
absolutely.
see them.
There's a few in Montreal. There's some in Buenos Aires, which Le Corbusier described as being in the US, because. But I've seen the Montreal ones, which are astonishing. But anyway, the thing with those is that kind of idea that they looked absolutely eternal for him. That they looked like, and this comes about later in Wilhelm Boringer's book on Egyptian art, where he goes, Egyptian architecture is like American industrial architecture, because both were, kind of big, stupid empires with a stupid culture. It's a great book.
Great. Wow, that was a good riff. What time do we have? A few minutes. Is this a program that's supposedly ending at 7? Okay, we have time for a lot of questions, therefore. And I bet there are some maybe architects in the room, Corbusier fans, people want to know more about any given subject. But that was a beautiful play right there. And I want to pick up on that in a second. But let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. I hope so. Abraham. Virginia, somebody. Yes. Andrea.
I have a question. Okay. Wait, can you wait for the mic? Sorry.
Wait for the mic.
Okay.
I'm not going to give you this one.
Abraham, I'm coming back for you. Okay.
It's on.
Okay, Jeff, my question is for you, and it's about the show appears so inevitable after the fact, but it's not like typical photo work that I've seen at the Met. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the barriers that you had to overcome in order to make this exhibit possible.
Well, thank you. The main one was that COVID intervened, to be honest, and I couldn't get back to Germany. It was really good that I made as many trips to see the archive, and particularly to see the industrial landscape in the Ruhr Valley, the Ruhr region. I really learned a lot from traveling this space. You can't always do that, but it was something I needed to see the scale of these buildings. They seem to be scaleless in the photographs, and I don't think we as an institution would have been able to do as I think thorough an understanding of the nature of the work without actually seeing at least what a large plant, a large factory is like, and the relationship of the buildings to the other buildings, and also that sense of feeling that I got from actually going to the Kunstakademie in Dusseldorf and seeing this big pile of a building with enormous windows that's like a cathedral of knowledge, and seeing the artists scurrying in and out and thinking about the Bechers as teachers. So that was a big lift. I mean, we designed this for the Breuer building, which is an industrial building with poured concrete. It looks like it's, barricaded from the city. It has a drawbridge in front of it. It has strange windows and it's hard. It was designed for the 4th floor. I think it would have looked great there. Interestingly, I think that the space that the show is in, for those of you who haven't seen it, you'll have to just trust us, has a kind of 2-part aspect. It has more intimate galleries where smaller scale works look very good, and this big room where the sort of the apotheosis of the work is presented, this sort of crescendo. So that's my best answer for that. Yeah, next. Don't ask me questions, please. We have 2 great scholars with us.
Thanks for this great discussion. It's been fantastic. One of the things I've always loved about the Becher's work is this, this notion of afterlife I see also in the kind of these traces of historical and vernacular architecture that seems to crop up. I mean, whether it's sort of notions of half timbering or gabled roofs or wooden slats. And I wonder if anyone in the panel would sort of like to comment on this kind of push and pull of historical vernacular traditional architecture, which crops up sometimes in these industrial buildings. And is that intentional, or any general thoughts on
that? I think it probably is. And, that was a thing that was sort of doing the rounds in the 50s. There's a great book that the architectural press in Britain put out in the 50s called The Functional Tradition, which is sort of full of these sort of 18th and 19th century industrial buildings, which could easily have been Roman buildings. They have this kind of elemental quality. But the thing that I like about these, and particularly about the timber framed ones, particularly looking at that with an English eye, is that they're very, very functional. They're functional and vernacular at once. And half timbering, because of the arts and crafts movement and the property boom of the 1920s, in Britain is usually, obviously, it's a fake. It's an applique on a brick structure. Whereas these buildings are that the wood that you can see there, that's the structure. That they're as sort of honest in that regard as any modernist building of the 60s. Probably more so in lots of regards. But the other aspect to that, I think, is quite different, which is where you kind of look at a grain silo and some of these photos, and you see like a kind of a pitched roof on top of it, or a kind of bit of Gothic architecture on top of it, which is a totally different thing. That's actually much more of a kind of like trying to kind of, I guess, sort of ingratiate the kind of new and frightening form by kind of adding a layer of traditional architecture onto it.
Is that sort of like the decorated shed?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's that thing that that the British railway station has in the 19th century. The conflict between, and it sometimes is a conflict between an incredible piece of iron and glass kind of futurist architecture and a Flemish Gothic hotel in front of it, like at St Pancras Station, whose architect really resented the fact that he was having to do it in front of this like incredible futurist station, and was like, my building is too good for this. Literally, the architect of that said that his hotel was too good for the railway station, which says it all about Victorian architects.
Yeah, half timbering, by the way, in the United States, almost its only application is what you call stockbroker tutor. Certain neighborhoods of certain suburban towns, and so to see it being, where it actually comes from in Wattle and Daub can be startling.
Yeah. Walker Evans was a great photographer, but he grew up in Kenilworth outside of Chicago, which was one of these stockbroker villages with an English style of this framework house style.
And all the streets were named after people in Sir Walter Scott.
That's right. This idea of the decorative and the industrial is a really big subject for discussion, maybe for another time. But you said something, Owen, about the train station. I think it's interesting that the Bechers seem not to have photographed some of the things that one would have expected, and like the facade of train stations. Maybe they did. I haven't seen those pictures. I'm getting a slight head shake from our friend Max. But it's and as far as I know, they didn't photograph the Eiffel Tower either, because it was already a structure. But I'm also, yeah, it was a sculpture. It already was doing its thing. But I'm just thinking of Eugene Atget, the documentarian of the streets of Paris, and the things that he did not photograph, as opposed to what he did. And I think the Bechers chose subjects that resonated to them for their own particular purposes. And one example would be these very thin electric pylons, which they photographed early in their work and didn't carry it through to its logical end, because I think they didn't fill the frame as well as other objects that they were more interested in, which is itself interesting.
And that's the thing, right? I mean, a kind of, a train shed, can't be a sculpture. It's, it's a space. It's a thing you're within. And you just can't really do that with it. But I think also probably the other reason is that they, even in that period, it was the kind of the low point for train travel. They'd still be full.
But also, I think because the things they chose to photograph are the things that, in their context, at the time they were photographing, these were the parts of the landscape that you would see but not look at, whereas a train station you would actually look at.
That's a very good point. I remember that in Time magazine interviewed the Bechers in 1969, which I was totally surprised that they had emerged to that level. And they were asked, like, well, what would you like to photograph today? And it was right after the landing on the moon. And I don't remember whether it was Hilla or Bernd said, the lunar landing module. And you can feel that. Yeah. And we illustrated it in the book, which I highly recommend. Yeah. You asked a question too. Excellent. 3.
I'm not sure how much time we have.
As much time as we need.
Okay. I wanted to draw together the many comments that you were circling around about the sanitization of industrial scape. And I'm thinking in my own life, from my own perspective, of the Gowanus Canal and the destruction of the afterlife that I'm seeing there for the sake of bettering
the City Beautiful movement,
but also cleaning up a Superfund site. So I'm thinking about the way sheds sanitize. I'm thinking about the comments that you've made about cleaning up and tearing down industrial structures. And I'm wondering specifically about how the lighting choices that they made either play into creating a more authentic engagement with the sculptural subject, or how it's sort of an anti-sanitization, or whether it's creating uniformity. I don't know what it's doing. I'd like you to comment on how light plays into that thinking.
It seems to me that what they were after was the light of objectivity, and trying to dispel subjectivity as introduced by weather, topography, stance, all that kind of thing. So trying to, some Platonic notion that, without no disrespect intended, but it's, finding the picture that could be used to illustrate the object in a dictionary.
That's beautiful. And hold on, Owen. And that sort of non-style style, which doesn't tag it to any time, which allowed them to compare pictures over 40 years, which they certainly didn't know when they began, and it does work. That's very interesting. And the neutrality of the lighting was a useful comparative tool structurally, formally, compositionally.
I also like the fact that it just distances them massively from architectural photography. Say that again? It distances them massively from architectural photography, which I think even at its best is all about, look at this wonderful light. The actual Le Corbusier quote of his definition of architecture, the magnificent play of forms in light. And here it's like, light is many things, but it's not magnificent. Just one point on erasure, something I can't believe I've not really mentioned. I'm kind of intrigued by I presume you'll have gone to when you were going to the Ruhr, the kind of park that Kohlhaas and the OMA made out of the mining and steelwork structures outside Essen, which are, I think, the only examples of a kind of industrial, restoration of industrial buildings done by people who are probably fans of and influenced by the Bechers.
We did. It's like a beer garden. It's a theme park. It's bizarre, and it made me smile that I was actually seeing this place that I had been looking at in photographs, and now I was seeing it as a theme park. Very bizarre, but it was very instructive. The photographs are used there.
Yeah, precisely, and it's, as much as you can in a project like that, it's done quite unromantically. Like, it's not. There are examples, particularly in the UK, of really, really kind of sentimental, kind of brass band nostalgia, kind of restorations of industrial structures. Whereas, in the Ruhr, it's very kind of like, here it is, we've cleaned it up, there it is.
Yeah, we put a fence around it. You can climb up a little couple of steps and you can buy a T-shirt and have a beer. Yeah. I appreciated it. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions.
As an architecture student in the early 70s, we discovered the Bechers and their books, and they were quite inspirational because it was truly form following function, and it was showing structure on the outside and the forms. Can you speak a little bit about the influence they had on architects, especially from the 70s and 80s, and the complexities that these images showed that buildings were?
So I'm trying to think of who I think really has been influenced by them. I think from the 70s, you can trace a line to OMA. You can trace a line to things like John Haydock. Do you think?
A little.
I think it's a bit too bling.
Okay.
But yeah, maybe. But definitely John Haydock and that kind of quite sort of oblique eye that he had. And there's a definite kind of element of his work sort of being like the kind of tower in Kreuzberg and Berlin being these sort of strange sort of Becher-like objects. I think they're probably also popular with sort of more recent architects such as Crusoe, St. John, or Sergis and Bates, and that kind of very kind of objective and matter-of-fact way of doing architecture. But the way that I think a lot of 70s architects, particularly actually in the UK and in France, looked at industrial architecture was romantic. That something like, sort of Richard Rogers and Foster and those sorts of people, and what they do at things like the Pompidou and Lloyd's is very, very unlike what the Bechers do, because it's constructivist, it's flamboyant, it's romantic, it's dramatic, it's, it's the from below thing. It's, you can hear the Shostakovich when you look at it. And with this, it's not Shostakovich, it's Kraftwerk.
Kelly.
So I read a lot of natural history books and field guides of birds and plants and bugs and things. And I'm often struck by how the typology arrangement reminds me of birds on a page in a field guide. So I was wondering if there was any direct acknowledgement of that in their work.
Okay. This is the husband answering the wife's question. Clearly, I have failed over and over and over. The organization of information in a bird guide or a census of any visual form and the history of science illustration is very much part of the language that I think Hilla Becher brought to their partnership. And the Ernst Haeckel, which we illustrate in two examples in the floor case with her early photographs, I think tries to connect this. And I think if they were interested in how the information that is in the picture is being presented, they were certainly aware of the history of science and the Linnaean idea of families and classes and orders and type and typology. And I think the exhibition explores that, I think, pretty effectively, and certainly the catalog.
One visual analog that struck me was to Bertillon's charts of facial contours, facial, noses, chins, ears, etc., that were made for the purposes of portrait parlé in French, that is spoken description by a crime victim of their assailant. So you could pick out, well, he had this kind of whorl in his ear, he had this kind of nose, and the way these are set up in these huge charts by Bertillon, ear. I mean, there's something very reminiscent of, because it's difficult to figure out what order to put them in exactly, but it could almost be subjective resemblances there, but it's presented in a scientific way. It, very much like the typologies.
I'm sorry. I suppose is there also a sort of joke there at the expense of that sort of Linnaean type thing? Because of course, comparing it to like Kunstformen into Natur or something like that, that attempts to be a science, and obviously it has all sorts of like quite dubious outgrowths in 20th century, and this isn't. I think there's an element of it being quite a dry joke at the expense of that sort of, taxonomic kind of evolutionary kind of. It's particularly because it's not describing an evolution; it's describing a whole load of things that are about to disappear off the face of the earth.
The opposite of evolution. One of the great pleasures of working in this museum is that we get to do educational programs, and we have two really lovely scholars here. We planned this quite some time ago. This show was delayed for more than 2 years, and I am really honored that all of our partners, all of our lenders, all of our funders, all of our museum public, and the educators that bring programs like this have come back together from a curatorial point of view, from an intellectual point of view. We really need you to complete what we do. You are the audience for what we are trying to communicate, and the art is there for you. And we hope you come, see the show, let us know how you respond. And with that, I want to thank our speakers and thank Mariana, who put this together, and my team, and my colleague Virginia, and the other Virginia, and all of you. Thank you. Have a good evening.